Welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. We live in a fascist dictatorship. Trump's neofascism is here now. Here are 10 things you can do to resist it. A guide to Trump's fascist presidency, from ignoring judge to erasing history. Mad King Trump's tariff disaster. Fit for a king? Trump's moves challenge world order and U.S. bureaucracy. These are all headlines I found in 5 minutes this morning, Googling Trump fascist, Trump fascism, Trump king, and is Trump a monarch? For weeks, the legacy media, and mostly the left side of the commentariat, has been declaring the end of the American democracy, invariably calling Trump the resurrection of Hitler, Mussolini, or Mad King George. Most of these proclamations are steeped in a "we told you so" energy, and frankly, these reads on Trump and MAGA have been around since his first term of office from 2016 to 2020. But honestly, when do we stop blaming the symptom without looking for the cause? If Trump is the new tyrant, we, with our cult worship of the presidency, and Congress, with its corruption and spinelessness, give the White House such extraordinary powers with which to eschew the checks and balances of our constitutional republic. In other words, did we ask for this? Here to talk about this today are two scholars in politics, history, and culture from 2 points on the political spectrum. Gene Healy comes from the libertarian perspective. He is vice president for policy at the Cato Institute and is a contributed editor at Liberty Magazine. He is also the author of The Cult of the Presidency, America's Dangerous Devotion to Executive Power, which was updated in 2024. We also welcome Daniel Bessner of the American Prestige podcast. He is also associate professor in American foreign policy at the University of Washington and is the author of Rethinking U.S. World Power, Domestic Histories of U.S. Foreign Relations, among other books. So thank you guys for joining me today on Trip the Beltway Fantastic.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely. So Gene, let's start with you, as you have written a book that makes the argument that in part, this is all our fault. Cato describes your book as thus: Americans on each side of the red-blue divide demand a president who can create jobs, teach our children well, tend the national soul, and vanquish their culture war enemies. Our political culture has invested the office with preposterously vast responsibilities. And as a result, the office holder wields powers that no human being ought to have. Gene, can you put the assertions of your book in the context of today? In other words, it seems that Trump is the manifestation of very powerful forces that began churning long before his presidency. So how did we get here?
Yeah, that question is a book in itself. I think Donald Trump did not invent the imperial presidency, but he's certainly become comfortable with it. He's in a way the extreme energy drink version of what's been on tap for a long time. And what's interesting about Trump 2.0 versus 1.0, if you look at the right out of the gate in the first term, there was one executive order on the first day in 2017, 26 in Trump 2.0. And he very quickly, Joe Biden had, held the modern land speed record for executive orders in the first 100 days of the presidency, and Trump has quickly eclipsed that, and we're, on day 60 or something like that. So the difference in the two presidencies was the amount of actual concrete executive action right out of the gate. If you look 8 years ago, if you look back at what people were freaking out about in Washington, D.C., it was, we're arguing about crowd size and alternative facts about how many people were in the inaugural. And he goes to the CIA and makes a campaign speech. A lot of the concerns the first time around were, presidential or unpresidential behavior. Now, I think the concern is, 80 some executive orders, some of them reversing Biden executive orders, some of them branching out into new territory. So Trump is sort of, it's not a new phenomenon, but it's an acceleration of what, of the trends of the most powerful office in the world having become even more powerful over the last 20, 30 years.
And how did we, the people, give him the tools to do this?
It's a process that involves a lot of congressional abdication, but also the demands that Americans place on the presidency. The presidency is an office that's supposed to teach the children well, respond to hurricanes, deal with disorder around the globe. The demands we place on the presidency, it's sort of the old Spider-Man thing with great power comes great responsibility. Well, it works the other way too. When you invest in office with the responsibility for vanquishing your culture war enemies, and even in some accounts, where you invest the office with responsibility for the state of the American soul, the person who occupies that office is going to seek power necessary to meet those responsibilities. And that's power nobody should have.
Dan, you mentioned, or you spoke a little bit about this on X recently, and it was in response to a post that no longer exists. So I don't know exactly what you were responding to, or at least I couldn't see it. But you also said that this is a process. This is something that's been happening over years. Centralized power in the executive, create a series of institutions that ensure the public, and in many instances, Congress can't affect policy. As this occurred, because governance still needed to happen, power accreted in the office of the presidency. This was always the potential outcome of this process of centralization and accretion. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I think there's one way, I'm a historian, just to frame this, that you can view the history of the United States from its founding until today as a story in which power increasingly centralizes in the executive branch, but really since World War II in the White House itself with the people around the president. So you could look at the history of the United States from the Civil War to World War I, with Lincoln, for example, suspending habeas corpus during the Civil War, or Woodrow Wilson pushing through various acts in 1917 and 1918 that allow him to deport political radicals, to FDR making the New Deal state to a significant degree, not through congressional legislation, although through some congressional legislation to be sure, but also through executive order, to World War II, when the United States emerged as a global colossus, and to my mind, essentially created a state and parastate that ensured that ordinary people, and as I mentioned in the tweet, Congress itself didn't really have much say in foreign relations. So speaking of the moment and the creation of the late 1940s, which I'm beginning to refer to as the Second New Deal, essentially you have the emergence of a state structure that is intended to manage international affairs. The CIA, the National Security Council, the forerunner to the Department of Defense, which eventually becomes the Department of Defense on one hand, and these are institutions that are really separate to a significant degree from Congress and the public's purview. Sure, Congress funds them, but oftentimes, as everyone here knows, in these blanket sort of funding schemes. But even in addition to that, you have the emergence of what scholars call parastatal institutions, the military-industrial complex, the military-intellectual complex, which really have a profound impact on the shaping of American foreign policy. And those are government institutions, so they're not subject to the same types of oversight as other sorts of government organizations. So as all that is happening, you basically have a distribution of power in various nodes throughout a matrix of institutions that's very difficult for even experts to keep a handle on. But what that winds up ironically doing is that that distribution of power ironically leads to the centralization of power with the person who has the authority to oversee everything. So you have the president assuming more and more authority, particularly over foreign policy making, which is my area of expertise. But I also think in terms of macroeconomic policy, which is partially divvied out to the Fed, which is not exactly the most democratically accountable institution, and partially centered on the president. It's always been himself. So you basically see a process over the course of the second half of the 20th century with more and more power being invested in the literal individual of the president and people around him, and in places like the National Security Council, the Council of Economic Advisors, the CIA, and other executive branch institutions. To the degree that a man in my field, I'm sure you all have heard of this book, Jeremy Suri, has called it the impossible presidency. If you just look at what a president is responsible for, it's basically impossible for any one individual to do. So you wind up having presidents basically focusing on their issue areas and essentially acting like elected monarchs. And if you go back to the late 18th century, I don't know, Gene, what you think of this. I think that was partially the intention, that they did think that you needed to invest authority in an individual, but they also thought that Congress would be much more powerful than it wound up doing. And just the history of the last 75 plus years is Congress basically giving up its authority. The statistic that I point to a lot, but it's very indicative, is that Congress hasn't officially declared war since 1942. In fact, the United States has only declared war 11 times. And as we all know, the United States has basically been in a state of near constant war since World War II, which just shows the degree to which the system is functioning in such a way that the executive has become the system in a way that is very frightening, because it gives any president, and not just Trump, but really any president, incredible authority. And so when you have someone like Joe Biden, who might be a little bit senescent, I don't know if you guys noticed, that's a pretty frightening thing. Or if you have someone like Donald Trump, who's basically, it seems to be challenging. I think a law professor said it's not whether we're in a constitutional crisis, it's the degree to which we are in a constitutional crisis. So it's a frightening institution. And I think that, and I'll end here, calling it something like fascism is profoundly misleading. This is, as to use a cliche, American as apple pie. This is the paradigmatic American institution. So if you have a problem with what's going on now, you have a problem with the American state structure.
Do you agree with that, Gene? Well, first of all, do you think we're in a constitutional crisis right now?
It's hard to say. I mean, if the administration starts rejecting, more than they're currently doing, playing around the edges, but openly defying, a ruling from the Supreme Court, then yeah, perhaps we're there. I think we've been in a low-level constitutional crisis for quite some time. I agree with everything Daniel said about the growth of executive power over the course of the 20th century, the shift of power, in some sense, from Madisonian institutions to Trumanite. I think that's Michael Glennon, his taxonomy. Trumanite institutions like the Pentagon and the National Security Agency, the intelligence communities. We really are seeing a change, I think, in the last 20 or 30 years as well. If you look back within our lifetimes, within living memory, there were always first week executive orders that flipped important policies when the presidency changed parties. But if you look back to 1993, when Bill Clinton comes in, there are two main executive orders that he flipped from the Reagan-Bush era. One is the Mexico City policy on foreign aid and abortion. The other was you have to post, whether you have to post a notice if you're a federal contractor about employees' BEC rights and whether they can be compelled to join a union. So those orders, used to be the two main orders that would flip when a new president from a different party took power. They're significant. They were orders that activists cared about a lot, but they didn't make a huge difference in Americans' lives. Now, when the presidency changes parties, you're talking about much more significant policy change, even on the in the domestic arena. Uh, you know, whether or not you're on the hook for your student loans, whether or not we're going to have a trade war with Canada, China, and Mexico. Um, you know, whether or not affirmative action is going and racial preferences are, promoted by the federal government. You have I don't think any of this was really part of any deliberate design. It was more in a fit of absence of mind. But the result of concentrating this much policy change and making a turn on which of two teams manages to win the White House has raised the stakes of presidential elections dramatically in a way that I think is really dangerous to domestic tranquility. Because if not just a couple of executive orders about foreign aid and abortion and union rights turn on who seizes the presidency, but a whole host of domestic policy issues. When you've raised the stakes that much, you run the risk of making every election a Flight 93 election.
I totally agree with that, and I'm on the verge of admitting that I was a bit wrong in my reading over the last two elections, because all around me, on both the left and the right, people have talked about the presidential election in very existential terms. And my response to a lot of what I saw as emotionalism had been, well, we have a system of checks and balances. I do not put that much investment, either personal or intellectual energy, into this election, because I know that the president isn't the end all be all. We have a Congress, we have a judiciary. And I'm listening to you guys on the call here, and I'm thinking maybe I was being a little naive, because, or I might have been in a little bit of denial, because I acknowledge everything you said about the long slip into a more powerful executive over the decades, and the weakening of congressional powers. Am I right to think that that maybe I should have been more concerned? First of all, and second of all, I guess the more important question is, and Cato mentions this in describing your book, Gene, about how politics has gone feral, with polls showing that substantial majorities of Democrats and Republicans view members of the other party as a serious threat to the United States and its people. That's the existential fight. Has that created a more powerful executive in itself by weakening the influence of Congress, or is it the reverse, that the strengthening of the executive has and impacted and infected our politics to the point that we no longer see Congress as influential, and everything is more of a zero sum when it comes to the presidential election every 4 years? Dan?
Maybe I could just jump in quickly. Very influenced by Marxist thought, and to me, that always pushes me to look at the structure. And to me, a lot of what we're seeing today is built into the literal structure of the American system. So when we're looking at sort of the existential language of politics, that was really tamped down during the Cold War for a variety of reasons. I think there was a genuine national project, and there was a genuine enemy that one could reasonably define as existential. I mean, personally, I don't think it was ever existential. I think the US is always way more powerful, but it wasn't so nuts to see the Soviet Union and its nuclear weapons, particularly when Stalin was governing, as an existential threat. But when you don't have a situation like that in a system that doesn't rely on coalition building, it is necessarily going to engender this type of existential all or nothing rhetoric, because it is not unlike a parliamentary system, one in which you necessarily need to work with other parties. And so I think this is something that you see political scientists see throughout presidential systems, particularly in Latin America, which has adopted, much to their chagrin, basically the American presidential system. The early 19th century revolutions were incredibly influenced by the American structure. And presidential systems are by definition unstable. And I think what has been unique about the United States is that it hasn't been, I think primarily for two reasons. One, we always had a lot of free land, and actually allowing people to go west and take free land really did act as a valve for conflict that in smaller societies, or in societies where 1/3 of your country is a rainforest that can't be settled, there's not as many places to go. So the settler aspect of the United States was really crucial to social peace, even though we did have a gigantic civil war in the 19th century in general that did lead to social peace. And then second, we were just so overwhelmingly powerful and had industrialized to such a significant degree that we were able to distribute resources in such a way that that also tamped down on conflict. But I think what's pretty clear now is that as we head further into the 21st century, and this is something that people, Americans have been worrying about for 130 years, but it's actually happening, that there's no real frontiers there's no real place to go any longer. There's no place to really open that valve and really tamp down on social conflict. And
Mars.
Neither party. Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
Mars.
And that's one of the reasons I think that Mars has become an obsession, is for precisely that reason. Beyond that, Gene, I'd like to hear your, I think global capitalism is now so complicated that people can't intervene in it like a JP Morgan or a Henry Ford was able to intervene in it. And why someone like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, why they want to go to the moon or Mars is not just because they're like nerdy guys, but because they don't feel like they can control the system here to the same degree that other people have. Even with the Doge now, right? Musk is very quickly finding out that it's not like you could buy Twitter and just do whatever you want, that there's actually going to be resistance. So I think all of these things lead to heightened social conflict that neither party is going to be willing to address, because their political success depends on them not addressing it. Their political success depends on them identifying, Trump as Hitler or all the loony Marxists in the Democratic Party. Yeah. And that's a structural problem that I don't see how it's solved, because if we had a constitutional convention, the Constitution would be brought to you by Amazon and Monsanto. So this is a gigantic problem that I don't see how we're actually going to be able to solve it, and people aren't even raising it.
Yeah, I think there are a number of factors that made the country more polarized. Some of them are just consumer choice. Who's the journalist who came up with the big sort? More and more people live surrounded by neighbors who are, politically like-minded. That's a trend that's been going on for 20, 30 years. In part because, if you take polls, people who identify as Republicans prefer space to grill and a lot of parking. People who identify as Democrats prefer urban amenities. We've self-segregated into, more politically homogenous communities, to the point where people don't, in general, don't have as many friends as they used to. That come from, that voted for the other guy. And we've also sort of mentally self-segregated as, we've moved away from 3 networks and, local newspapers to being able to curate our own news diets. And what people tend to do is they like to hear that it's the other side that is responsible for everything that's wrong in the country. But these are all secular trends that were happening, in part because of consumer choice. But when you combine this rising self-segregation into politically insular communities with a concentration of power in the presidency, such that, now when power changes hands, we're deciding, the shift from Biden to Trump, it affects what kid can use what bathroom in 13,000 school districts in the United States, who gets to use the girls' locker room, whether we're going to have the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education go after local communities that are banning LGBTQ books, or we're going to, under Trump, turn OCR against people who are teaching Ibram X. Kendi in local school districts. You are the combination of the trends toward polarization and the centralization of power in the executive branch, such that you're who is president is going to determine a lot of very fraught and contentious issues at the furthest remove from local communities. I think is really playing with fire, and you may like some of the policies depending on where you are on the political spectrum. You may like some of what Joe Biden does with executive orders. You may like some of what Donald Trump does with executive orders. But if we are deciding everything from war with Iran, trade war with China, to whether we can use plastic straws based on who occupies the Oval Office, all of the pressure is put on the center. And again, presidential elections become dramatically more high stakes and consequential than we should ever want them to be.
This is all very frightening. Are other branches of government, Congress and the judiciary, are they going to be effective in checking some of these powers that Trump is flexing right now? You talked about, I can't remember how many you said, executive orders. Was it 80?
He's over 80 now. Last I
Yeah.
checked, around day 50.
I believe it's 92. I just
Okay.
something like that. Yeah.
Well, I would imagine that all of those are constitutional, like that they could be challenged, whether in court or in Congress. But do you feel that those other branches have been degraded in a way that they won't be able to provide those checks during this presidency, and therefore bring back the semblance of the republic that we had before? Or has he opened the floodgates to just consistent situations in which either party is just going to eschew the checks and balances of the past, and then it's just going to be a strong executive, a powerful executive in whatever context that you can imagine from here on in?
I'll just answer quickly because I don't really know. I mean, I think a lot of this very clearly depends on norms. And if there's no, just go back to like basic realism 101, there's no way to enforce the laws, or if the military or police forces are not willing to do that, then there's nothing to stop anyone. And I don't think that's clear how those norms would, the norm to abide by a judicial ruling. I mean, it's technically a law, but I don't even know how that would even be enforced. So Gene, you probably have more expertise on this than I do, though.
Well, I don't know. What I have been surprised about, because I tended to discount claims that Trump would come in the second time hell-bent for vengeance with newfound expertise on how to pull the levers of power and work his will. You know, my perhaps naive assumption going in was this is a guy who appointed John Bolton, the national security advisor, presumably to get some advice on, foreign policy restraint. The idea of him becoming prepared and competent, I tended to discount. If you look at the first Trump term, obviously, there's no president in living memory that's talked as big an authoritarian game as Donald Trump did. His Twitter feed was like the Watergate tapes unspooling in real time. But if you look at the actual executive action, in the first Trump term, he was a bit of a low energy imperial president. A lot of what he threatened to do, never made it past the stage of appalling tweet. There was no follow through, and there were only a few areas where he innovated and seized new territory for the executive above the already overgrown baseline that he inherited. And those were in dusting off some old trade authorities from the Kennedy era and in the service of weaponizing them. And the use of national emergency powers. No president before Trump had ever looked out at the 130 some statutes that the president can unlock new powers with by declaring a national emergency. No president had ever thought to use it to do an end run around Congress in a budget battle because they won't fund your border wall. So those are two areas where Trump innovated. But in terms of, if you were to compare the level of executive power grabs in the first Trump term to Barack Obama or George W. Bush, he would look like a less imperial president, as counterintuitive as that seems. Now, I think with him coming out of the gate with this, flood the zone approach to executive action, there are a number of executive orders where he really is claiming a George W. Bush style prerogative to ignore the laws. The TikTok suspension without a shred of legal authority, the idea of rewriting the 14th Amendment, with the power of the pen. And I think it's pretty disturbing that he's converted the International Emergency Economic Powers Act into like a tariff button that he can just bang on in the office to start and threaten to start trade wars with major trading partners. So, I hazard to make a prediction about what's going to happen in the next 4 years because my record of predicting what was going to happen has not been spotless.
Well, I think one of the ironic things here is that the thing to explain is Trump's radicalization. Because there's clearly been a radicalization and intensification. And the ironic consequence might very well be that one of the key causes of his radicalization was people that he associated with the Democratic Party / liberal elites did try to come after him with the law. Yeah. And so there's also, that famous quote from The Wire, "You come at the king, you best not miss." They missed really badly. And so I think this is also something that we should consider going forward, is the use of lawfare and the use of other methods in terms of your political opponents. I don't think that's the only reason Trump was radicalized. My guess is it's probably a major reason that he's been radicalized this time around. I find it hard, just knowing what I know about the man, for that not to be, he's so personalist in his politics that I find it hard not to think that that's a really major reason that he's been so radicalized.
So does that mean that there'll be a further radicalization of the left? So the next time we have a Democratic president, we are to see the reverse?
Well, I have good news. One, the liberals are not the left, as I always remind people.
I hear you.
Very much liberals. Not the left.
We'll say liberals for this
liberals.
conversation.
I don't think the Democratic Party has the stones for that. I think it's been increasingly professionalized, and I think that they're such an Ivy League normative party that they're not going to be able to do it. I think the Democratic Party is in real crisis, and I don't see that themselves getting out of it. My guess, though, if I had to predict, I like predictions. No one can know. Everyone's always wrong. Is that from how Trump has acted, he's not going to be able to build a stable coalition. So we're going to see something like the late 19th, early 20th century, with flipping back and forth between parties. That you're not going to get the age of Roosevelt or the age of Reagan or the age of Trump, which like totally reforms politics. It doesn't seem like that's what's going on, but I could be wrong. But my guess is politics is going to be more sclerotic, not less.
I think the next Democratic president who comes in is going to take a page from Trump's playbook and govern extremely aggressively with executive action. When Joe Biden came in, he came out of the gate with such a flurry of executive orders that at one point the New York Times wrote an editorial saying, "Hey, ease up on the executive actions, Joe." So I, I think this situation of when power changes hands, when the presidency is in the hands of a new party, that it's pedal to the metal is something that is not going away. I think you're going to see the next Democratic president reverse a lot of, obviously reverse a lot of Trump's executive orders, and it really does put you in a situation where, you know, if puberty blockers are either mandatory or forbidden, depending on who seizes the Oval Office. The DEI in the federal government. I don't. Maybe they've learned their lesson there, and they won't reinstitute that. But I think being governed with the power of the pen. I'd predict the next Democratic president is going to come in about as aggressively as Donald Trump.
Yeah, I fear that too. I fear that we'll see the pendulum swinging wildly in the other direction. My last question is more of a short term. So we're only 60 days into this presidency. Lots has happened. I'm starting to see cracks, whether it be over foreign policy, what's going on with Israel, Gaza, and the apprehension of students off of college campuses here in the United States and being deported. And people on both sides of the aisle, mostly like libertarians on the right, are starting to get very uncomfortable with what they're seeing with the executive orders and power grabs. Do you think that there might be a backlash even within the 4 years of this presidency that he will be forced to put the brakes on? I don't have a lot of confidence that Congress is going to be doing it because it's so hyper partisan right now and on the razor's edge for the majorities in both houses. But could there be some other backlash that will compel Trump to put on the brakes? Or is that too hopeful?
I don't see how that backlash would come from the Democratic populace. I've written a lot about it. I just don't think when it comes to foreign policy, the Democratic populace has much impact. No. It should be different, but it is not the case. Trump also seems to care less this term. He seems angrier and he seems more nihilistic. Not only can't he, at least in theory, should he truly suspend the Constitution, run again, he's also older. He's probably more angry, a little bit more dyspeptic, as they say, and he seems to not give an F, as someone might say. So I think that at least to this day, it doesn't seem like much that happens exogenously is going to influence him, but that could always change.
Would there be slivers in his base, Gene? Maybe not the Democratic resistance, but would there be maybe some splintering on the right of the aisle?
There could be, but if you could talk him out of anything, I think people would have talked him out of roiling the markets by
that might be where it
hammering happens. That tariff button. What concerns me more is that we seem to be locked into this cycle where you take power and you use it for all it's worth. And that means a lot of policies flip every 4 to 8 years. I've tried to not adopt a permanent, bulwark level hysteria about it, because I don't think that really does anybody any good. We made it through the first Trump administration. Worse for the wear, but with the major institutions intact. I'd say that one of the problems Congress had, if you want to see a resurgent Congress, it's not just a matter of congressional will. I think what Daniel said earlier about the incentives in the system is right. Madison had this idea that everybody in each respective branch would have adequate incentive to safeguard their turf. And that's worked out just fine for the presidency because, practically every new president achieves Dick Cheney's goal of leaving the executive branch stronger than they found it. But Congress is an abstraction, and the incentives of individual congressmen and women are not to safeguard Congress's institutional turf. And
exactly.
even the reformers that if you wanted to get national emergency powers reform, trade powers reform, get some of these powers out of the presidency. The problem is now you need a veto-proof majority to pass framework legislation that would put them back in the box. And so it's not just a matter of Congress being feckless. The structural impediments to getting power out of the executive branch are really pretty formidable.
Yeah, and that would take new legislation to fix. So it is, and in part it is will, but it's a lot of work too. And I feel like our Congress is very much distracted by politics right now, rather than actually doing anything to protect the institution, as you say. So I really appreciate this conversation. I feel a little more depressed leaving the conversation than I did going in, but I feel more informed about why I'm feeling the way I am. And I don't get a sense from either of you that you're indulging any hysteria or emotionalism, that we have structural issues here that we have to deal with. And so thank you for broadening the conversation. That's all I really wanted to do today, and I appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
And I hope you'll come on again.
Oh, absolutely.
Sure.